This is my level 13 character in Torchlight. And this is what my early game character in PoE looks like at a similar time in progression. Now, with ExileCon qualifiers likely starting in the coming months, I want to share some thoughts I've had about the early game in ARPGs, and it's something I'm actually more passionate about than I thought. And particularly, I want to talk about why it's important and what I think is really conducive to a really good early game racing environment. So for context, I'm not a top early game racer in either ARPG that I'm going to be talking about here. In PoE, I'm no TIE Attack Killer, no Havoc, no TIE 23, but I am able to clock a 130 Act 5 and easily able to clear a 3-hour Act 10. In Torchlight, I'm even much more greener to the environment, but most recently I was able to do a 220 on a Frigid Transmission Icy Ring Gemma, which seemed to be on pace with the sort of top times I was seeing during the league start, at least globally. And actually, you know what? It doesn't really matter what my credentials are. Frankly, it's much more important that I think people are critically thinking about what early game racing could be like, because frankly, it is a topic that has a lot of potential to grow the ARP genre more broadly. You see, one of the biggest game developers around the world, Riot Games, actually constantly flaunts this idea that they're always losing money from their esports division. And I think they're really comfortable saying this, not because they're proud of losing money. Esports is a means to something much greater, and that's growing the game and growing the whole ecosystem of video games. See, when people watch esports, they're inspired to play more, they want to log back in, and they want to play the game, they want to optimize, they want to learn more. And I think the same can be applied to ARPGs. Now, that doesn't mean ARPGs need to be competitive, but I do think that the early game in ARPGs is a great forum for competition. And it's something that I think has been relatively untapped of late, especially, that can really bring in a much more diverse audience, a bunch of different content creators, which I know are really competitive by nature, and end up really growing the game. While longer races such as the Time Mark 6 Traveler race, the start of the season of Torchlight Infinite, and the Uber Boss race at the start of 3.18 in Path of Exile can be really interesting to watch, they're much more comparable to the world first races that we see in MMORPGs. They are long term, they're longer duration, and mostly they're meant to feature new content. When new content isn't presented in a longer race setting, we tend to see much less general population interest in these races. Frankly, because one, it's not that replayable to do things super long, and two, the optimizations and decision making tend not to be there for these longer races. Early game races, though, can be replayed really easily. They're short enough to maintain viewer attention, they don't jeopardize the health of gamers, especially over multiple runs, and they can be replayed enough to find real optimizations at a very granular level. Now, Torchlight has a really interesting opportunity to repave the space because of several main reasons. Firstly, the early game in that game is actually fun to do. It's not meant to be a gatekeeping, painful slog. Instead, players are given reasonable degrees of power, decision-making, agency, and don't have to fight really tough monsters right off the bat. More importantly though, in terms of racing though, there's a lot of options for mobility right away. And these options for mobility actually feel good. Now, it's not to say that mobility is always a good thing. I actually think that mobility creep basically branches towards two different types of skill expression. If you have a lot of mobility in a game, you get really high APM, really explosive skill expression. And if you have lower mobility in a game, you have more decision-making, patience, and planning type of skill expression. Now, I think both these are interesting in their own right, but in terms of a viewer experience, I think the former, in terms of more explosiveness and more mobility, is actually better. It's better in terms of its ability to capture a new viewer's eye, but it's also better at keeping the attention of Zoomers. Secondly, the early game in Torchlight, I still think, is relatively unsolved. Now, there's a lot of people that think Blink, Bow, Lethal Carino, the sort of reverse shooting thing that you're seeing on screen right now, is probably the most optimal skill to rush the early game with. But we also see melee runs approaching the same time, around 2 hours to complete all the campaign, and most recently, Gemma builds leveraging Frigid Transmission are really fast as well, because they're an instant mobility skill that does a lot of good damage. But the best part about early game unsolved racing is that it can be maintained long term by developers without necessarily introducing new content. And that's where being really heavy handed and being willing to explore new balance ideas comes into play. See, if you're willing to shift around the meta, if you're willing to really rebalance skills, you can really cheaply, from a resource perspective, keep things fresh. The last big thing I want to highlight that Torchlight gives us an example of is access to class-specific power really early on. Your first hero trait unlocks level 13, while the first major talent node unlocks when you allocate 10 points. These things can happen within the first 10-20 minutes of gameplay, and they're both gigantic decision points for your build that can push your build into unique directions, giving you something like between 25 to 50% more damage at times. When class diversity happens this early on, yes, it can lead to more pigeonholing, but I think that as long as you have the opportunity to respec and change things around, it can force a greater range of creativity and, more importantly, a greater range of build diversity and gameplay. Let me know, especially if you disagree in particular. I'm always interested to hear what people think about making a competitive environment out of something that shouldn't be competitive to begin with. And even though I don't think competition should be everywhere, I do think it can be in certain places, and early game ARPGs are just a ton of fun to watch, and I think have a lot of untapped potential still. Shout out again to XD for helping me out with this video. And it'll probably be the last one for a bit, especially as Gauntlet starts to ramp up and my practice really starts to intensify. I'll try to send an update with what I'm planning to do if my next practice run goes all smoothly, but for now I'll just try not to bait you guys with anything new.